To understand this case, you have to understand 1981 Jakarta. The city was loud, fast, and largely unmonitored. There were no security cameras on residential streets. Telephones were shared between neighbors, and the technology that was quietly revolutionizing the way ordinary people captured their lives was the audio cassette. Portable recorders had dropped in price. Young professionals bought them for music, for language practice, for letters sent overseas to family. Waddy used hers for something different. She was being followed. For 3 weeks before that October evening, she had complained to her sister about a man. He stood outside the shipping office at the end of her shift. He sat 2 tables away at the warung where she bought lunch. He never spoke to her. He never approached. He simply waited until she noticed him, held her gaze for a moment, and walked away. She told a coworker. The coworker laughed. She told her landlord. He told her to be careful walking home. She told the police. They took down her name and never followed up, so she did the only thing she could think of. She started carrying her cassette recorder in her handbag. If he ever spoke to her, she wanted his voice. She wanted proof, and here is the part most retellings of this case skip. She was not paranoid. She was in nearly every detail correct. If this case is gripping you, save this video. You will want to come back to this one once the second half lands. Because we will get to the voice in a moment, and that is where this story turns into something far stranger than a stalking case. It becomes a question about how long a single sound can survive and what it can prove. On the night of October 14th, Waddy did not come home. Her sister, who lived 2 blocks away, came by the next morning. The door was unlocked. The apartment was undisturbed. The kettle was cold. The bed had not been slept in. On the small wooden desk near the window, the cassette recorder sat upright, the tape inside fully wound to the right, as if it had finished recording and stopped on its own. Her sister did not play it. She called the police first. And in one of the few procedural choices that would later save this case, the responding officer took the recorder into evidence without rewinding it. Waddy was found 3 days later in a vacant lot near the Siliwang River. The cause of death was not publicly released at the time, and the family has asked it remain that way. What investigators did release eventually was this. She had been followed home. The struggle had begun inside her apartment, and whoever did this had spent enough time there to make tea, drink half of it, rinse the cup, and leave it on the counter. The cassette was logged. It was listened to. It contained exactly 41 minutes of ambient apartment sound, footsteps, water running, a kettle, followed by 7 seconds of a man's voice. The voice said in Bahasa Indonesia a single sentence. Roughly translated, "You should not have written my name down." Then nothing. Then the click of the recorder stopping. That sentence became the entire case, because investigators had no idea what name, they had no idea where she had written it, and they had no suspect whose voice they could compare it to. The tape was sealed. The file was shelved. And for the next 40 years, Waddy's name appeared on a list of Jakarta's unsolved homicides without anyone seriously expecting movement. Here is what changed. In 2019, the Indonesian National Police began a quiet partnership with a small forensic audio lab that had previously consulted on aviation cockpit recordings. The lab's specialty was something called speaker identification, the process of breaking a recorded voice down into measurable patterns and comparing it to a known sample. It is not voice recognition the way your phone unlocks. It is closer to fingerprinting. Pitch contour, formant frequency, the precise way a person closes the sound at the end of a word. The lab was given a backlog of cold case audio. Waddy's 7 seconds were in that backlog. For 2 years, nothing happened. Because speaker identification only works if you have something to compare against. Without a suspect, the voice was just data. The breakthrough did not come from forensics. It came from a notebook. In late 2021, Waddy's sister, then in her 60s, agreed to allow investigators to review the personal effects that had been returned to the family in 1981. Among them was a small pocket diary Waddy had carried in her purse. Detectives at the time had photographed every page and seen nothing useful. But this time, a younger investigator noticed something on the inside back cover. 3 names, written in pencil, faded but legible, each one struck through with a single line. 2 of the men were quickly identified, located, and cleared. They were former co-workers Waddy had briefly suspected and then ruled out herself. The 3rd name belonged to a man who had, in 1981, briefly delivered office supplies to her workplace. He had been questioned once that year and released. He had moved cities twice since. He was now 73 years old, living in a coastal town and on a state pension. Investigators obtained a court order. They visited him under the cover of a routine interview about an unrelated matter. They recorded the conversation. They compared 11 seconds of his speech to Waddy's 7 seconds. The match was, in the lab's official phrasing, of extremely high probability. Same pitch range, same regional vowel shape, same micropause before the final consonant of certain words, a verbal tic he had carried his entire adult life and never noticed. He was arrested in early 2022. The case was, after 41 years, formally closed. The question almost everyone asks at this point is the wrong question. People want to know why he did it. The more revealing question is why he said it. Forensic psychologists who have reviewed similar cases describe what happened in that apartment as a kind of compulsive correction. He had spent weeks watching her. He had built in his own mind a relationship in which he was invisible and powerful. The moment he realized she had been recording, that she had been documenting him, the imagined relationship collapsed. He had been seen, and not just seen, written down. For a certain personality type, being named is the unforgivable act. Researchers studying stalking-related homicide have found that the moment a victim takes a concrete action to identify the stalker, a police report, a written name, a photograph, the risk of violence increases sharply. Not because the stalker fears legal consequences, because the act of being named breaks the fantasy that they are in control of the narrative. His sentence on the tape was not a threat in the traditional sense. It was a confession of grievance. In his mind, she had done something to him. By writing his name in her diary, she had stolen something from him. He believed, with the warped logic these offenders so often display, that he was the victim of her record-keeping. There is one more layer here. He spoke directly into the recorder. He knew it was running. He let it run. Investigators interviewed him for over 40 hours after his arrest, and he reportedly offered no real explanation for this except one sentence, paraphrased in court documents. He wanted her to know he had heard her. That is the psychology of this case in a single line. He wanted the last word. He gave it to her on a tape that 4 decades later gave it back to a jury. Drop in the comments if you were Waddy's sister, and a detective showed up at your door in 2021 asking to look through a box of belongings you had not opened since 1981. Would you have said yes? Or would you have left it sealed? CTA 1213 Min. If cases like this, the small, forgotten ones, the ones where the evidence was always there and just needed someone patient enough to listen. If these are the cases you want more of, subscribe and hit the bell icon. New case every day. And the case I am posting next is one most channels will not touch because the answer involves something you cannot unhear. But that is only half the story. The next part is where most people get this completely wrong. Outro 1315 Min. There is a tendency when a cold case is solved to call it justice. And there is justice in this. A man who lived 4 free decades after taking a young woman's life will not live a free one more. Her name, kept private at her family's request, is nonetheless spoken now in a courtroom, in a verdict, in a record that will outlast everyone involved. But there is something quieter underneath. Waddy's tape was sitting in an evidence locker for 40 years. The notebook with 3 names was photographed in 1981 and looked at again properly in 2021. The voice did not change. The handwriting did not change. The evidence was complete from the beginning. What changed was who was willing to sit with it. That is the real lesson of the Jakarta cassette. Cold cases are rarely cold because we lack evidence. They are cold because, somewhere along the way, someone closed the file. And every so often, a younger investigator, or a sister with a shoebox, or a forensic lab with patience and a spectrogram, decides to open it again. If this hit, my deep dive on the 1985 Bandung warehouse case will make even more sense now. Same era, same flawed early forensics, and a piece of physical evidence that nobody at the time understood what they were looking at. The link is on screen. Waddy pressed record. 40 years later, somebody pressed play. That is the entire case. Jakarta, October 1981. A young secretary pressed record on a cassette tape and captured 7 seconds of audio that no investigator could use until 2021. This is the story of a stalking case that became a homicide, a notebook that sat unread for 40 years, and a forensic voice match that finally named the man responsible. We examine the original investigation, the 2021 forensic breakthrough, the role of speaker identification science, and the criminal psychology behind a stalker who needed the last word. If you want more cold cases solved by small, overlooked evidence, subscribe and hit the bell icon. New case every day. 00, 00, the tape 00, 45 Jakarta 1981 03. 00, the night she did not come home 06. 00, the notebook nobody reread 09. 00, why being named is the unforgivable act 12. 00, what this case reveals 13. 30, the next case, true crime, cold case, CrimeDossier.